The factory was a relic, a crumbling skeleton on the edge of the city, set for demolition in a few weeks. I'd been hired as night security, tasked with keeping vandals, squatters, and copper thieves out. I'd worked similar jobs before, and it was usually uneventful, sometimes even relaxing. But this place felt different from the moment I walked in. Something about it clung to my skin like a thick, suffocating blanket. On the first night, I brushed it off as nerves. I'd heard stories about places like this, how old buildings seem to absorb the memories of all the pain and sweat that passed through them over the years. Maybe it was just the weight of that history pressing down on me. I told myself to get a grip as I started my rounds, moving through the vast, decaying factory, with my flashlight cutting swaths through the dust-choked air. The silence was oppressive. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like the whole world had forgotten about you. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind rattling the broken windows set my nerves on edge. I found myself checking the time obsessively, watching the hours crawl by. It was around 2 in the morning when I first heard it. A faint humming sound, like someone was idly singing to themselves. At first I thought I'd imagined it. The building made so many weird sounds that I assumed it was just metal shifting or the wind whistling through the cracks. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A low, steady hum, almost like a lullaby. It seemed to be coming from the second floor. My heart started pounding, but I knew I had to check it out. Probably just some homeless guy who'd snuck in looking for a place to crash. I made my way toward the staircase, the metal groaning under my weight as I climbed. The humming grew louder with every step I took. By the time I reached the second-floor landing, it filled the space around me, vibrating in my bones. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, but there was no one in sight, just rows of rusted machinery and piles of debris. Then I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the factory floor, illuminated by the dim light filtering through a cracked window. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I focused on the shape. It was tall and thin, draped in what looked like a tattered black cloak that hung loosely around its skeletal frame. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, its back turned to me. The humming was coming from it. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I forced myself to take a step forward. "Hey!" I called, my voice shaky. "This is private property. You're not supposed to be here." No response. The figure didn't even flinch. I swallowed hard and took another step, raising my voice. I said, "You're not supposed to be here." Still nothing. The figure remained perfectly still, the eerie humming continuing to fill the air. Something about the way it stood, so rigid, so lifeless, made my stomach twist. I was maybe 10 feet away when the humming abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched, frozen in place, as the figure began to turn. It moved slowly, unnaturally, like its joints were rusted, its limbs jerking awkwardly as it rotated to face me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I could barely breathe, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As it finally turned to face me, the beam from my flashlight sputtered and died. Darkness swallowed the room, and I was left standing there, blind and terrified. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking, but before I could get it working again, I heard a voice. A low, raspy whisper, like sandpaper scraping against metal. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent ice through my veins. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of debris, and hit the ground hard. My flashlight clattered away, rolling into the shadows. But I didn't care. All I could think about was getting away. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst from my chest. The sound of the figure's voice still echoed in my ears as I sprinted toward the stairs, not daring to look back. I heard something, movement, maybe footsteps, but I didn't stop to find out. I flew down the stairs, almost falling as I hit the bottom, and ran out of the factory into the cold night air. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with my keys in the darkness. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and floored it out of there, my pulse racing, my mind reeling. I never went back. I called the site manager the next morning and told him I was done. He didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any. But I still think about it sometimes, that figure, the way it stood there, so still, so silent, until it turned to face me. I never saw its face, not really. But in the darkness just before I ran, I caught a glimpse of something wrong. To this day, I don't know what it was that I encountered in that factory. Maybe it was just my imagination, running wild in the dead of night. Or maybe, just maybe, something far more sinister was waiting in the shadows, and I'm grateful I didn't stick around to find out. It started on my 3rd shift at St. Swithin's. I'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. The hospital was notorious for its strange happenings. The dark history of unexplained deaths and suicides whispered about in break rooms. But I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. I chalked it up to bored night staff trying to spook the new guy. That was until the night I found myself on the graveyard shift, alone. I was a fairly new nurse, only a few months into my rotation. The hospital was ancient, its walls echoing with a kind of history you could feel in your bones. Walking down the dimly lit corridors at night was unnerving, to say the least. Shadows stretched longer than they should, and the air felt thick, like something was watching you. But it was just nerves. At least, that's what I told myself. It wasn't long before I started noticing odd things, cold spots, whispers that seemed to follow me as I made my rounds. You learn to ignore these things, to push them aside as tricks of the mind. But it's harder to ignore when they persist, day after day, or rather, night after night. Room 302 was one of those places. No one ever went in there. The door was always locked, and it wasn't listed on any of the current patient charts. I assumed it was just out of use. But every night, as I passed that door, something pulled at me. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like fingernails scraping against wood. I convinced myself it was the building settling, nothing more. But the sound grew louder. It was around the 4th night when I started feeling it, an intense pressure, like the air itself was pushing in on me. I'd be updating charts at the nurses' station when I'd feel it, a presence behind me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, but each time I did, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching out behind me, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly, mocking my paranoia. By the end of the week, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The scratching from room 302 had gotten louder, more insistent. It was as if something, or someone, was trapped inside, desperate to get out. But that was ridiculous, right? I kept telling myself that until the moment I found the keys. It was an old key ring, tucked away in a drawer at the nurse's station, forgotten beneath years of paperwork. I shouldn't have taken it. I should have left it there, left room 302, locked away. But something in me needed to know what was behind that door. That night, I found myself standing in front of room 302, heart pounding, fingers trembling, as I tried each key in the lock. The scratching had become relentless, a steady, rhythmic scraping that vibrated through the door. My breath came in shallow gasps as one of the keys finally clicked and the door creaked open. The room was dark, the air inside stale and suffocating. A smell of decay hit me like a wave, and I had to fight the urge to gag. My hand fumbled for the light switch, and when the bulb flickered on, I wished I hadn't. The room was a time capsule. Dust covered every surface, and the bed was stripped bare, its mattress stained and sagging. But that wasn't what made my stomach lurch. No, it was the wall beside the bed, scratched deep into the plaster, as if gouged by desperate hands, were the words, "Help me." I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The scratches were raw, fresh. Whoever had carved those words had done it recently. I took a step closer, squinting at the wall. That's when I noticed something else. A dark smear trailing down from the scratches, like blood. A chill crawled up my spine. The sound behind me was soft at first, like the creak of a floorboard under pressure. I spun around, expecting to see one of the other nurses, maybe someone trying to play a prank. But there was no one there. Just the open door, and the hallway beyond. And then the door slammed shut. I rushed towards it, my hand reaching for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, panic rising in my chest as the scratching sound started again, this time from inside the room. My eyes darted around the darkened corners, looking for the source, but there was nothing there. Nothing, except the bed. That's when I saw it. A dark shape, curled up beneath the mattress. At first I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But then it moved. I backed up, my heart hammering in my chest. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if the thing beneath the bed was trying to claw its way out. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, to pull at the door again, my knuckles white from the effort. Still, it wouldn't open. The thing beneath the bed started to rise. I could see it now. A twisted, contorted figure, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its face obscured by shadow. But I could feel its eyes on me, cold and hollow. It reached out with one skeletal hand, its fingers scraping against the floor as it dragged itself towards me. I don't know how I managed it, but the door suddenly gave way, and I stumbled backward into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I could still hear the scratching, the desperate claws trying to get through. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside the hospital, gasping for air, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, the result of too many long shifts, but the scratches on my arm told a different story. I never went back to room 302 after that. But sometimes, late at night, when the hospital is quiet and the air feels heavy, I swear I can still hear the scratching. Working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience store isn't exactly thrilling, but it pays the bills. For me, a college student barely scraping by, the late-night hours provided the perfect opportunity to study between customers. Most nights were uneventful, an occasional drunk stumbling in for snacks, or a trucker grabbing coffee to power through the last leg of his trip. That night started out like any other. The usual fluorescent hum buzzed in the background, mixing with the steady drone of the refrigerators. Outside, the parking lot was empty, illuminated only by the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. I was restocking the shelves, lost in my thoughts, when I felt it, a sudden, suffocating chill. It was as though the temperature had plummeted, and with it came the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned, heart thumping, and there he was. A man stood in the doorway, just inside the store. He was tall and gaunt, his frame draped in a dark, weathered jacket, the hood pulled up to conceal most of his face. The way he stood there, motionless, almost blending into the shadows, unnerved me immediately. My throat went dry. Something about him set off every alarm in my body. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe he was just another late-night customer. Nothing weird about that. But the way he stood, perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me, made my skin crawl. Minutes ticked by, but he didn't move. He didn't browse, didn't speak. He just stared. Can I help you with something?" I finally managed to ask, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. Nothing. The man didn't respond. His eyes, no, not eyes, dark, empty pits, stared right at me from beneath his hood. My pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from this man, but I was frozen in place, trapped by the oppressive silence that hung between us. Then, without a word, he began to move. Slowly, deliberately, he walked toward the counter, his footsteps making no sound against the tiled floor. Each step felt like a countdown, an inevitable march toward something terrible. My heart thudded in my chest, adrenaline pumping through my veins. He was coming straight for me. When he reached the counter, he stood still again, towering over me. Up close, I could see the details, or rather the lack of them. His face, shrouded in shadow, gave away nothing, and those eyes, still hollow, still staring, seemed to pull at me, drawing me in like an abyss. I wanted to speak, to ask what he wanted, but fear clamped down on my throat, choking the words before they could form. Then, slowly, almost methodically, he reached into his jacket pocket. My mind raced. Was he armed? Was I about to be robbed? Or worse? But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a small, white card. He placed it on the counter, his movements deliberate and precise. For a moment my eyes were glued to it, my breath caught in my chest. When I finally mustered the courage to look down, my blood ran cold. The card was blank. No writing, no logo, just an empty, white rectangle. My hand trembled as I reached for it, compelled by some unseen force, even though every fiber of my being screamed to leave it alone. The moment my fingers touched the card, I felt a sudden jolt, like an electric shock. I yanked my hand back, staring at the man in disbelief. But he didn't react. He just kept staring. Silent, unblinking. I wanted to run, to bolt out the door and never look back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped, pinned in place by the weight of his gaze. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there in a standoff, me frozen in terror, him exuding an aura of malevolence so thick it was suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He simply walked away, disappearing into the night without so much as a backward glance. I stood there, breathless, heart hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I glanced down at the card again, its blank surface almost mocking me. My head swam with questions, none of which I could answer. Moments passed, maybe minutes, maybe hours, I wasn't sure, and I finally snapped back to reality. I rushed to the door, my mind still reeling. I pushed it open and stepped outside, scanning the parking lot. But he was gone. No sign of him anywhere. The street was deserted, save for the flickering streetlight and the faint rustle of wind. It was as if the man had never existed. I went back inside, trying to shake the lingering dread, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? What did he want? And why leave that card? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, or what little I could see of it, staring at me from the darkness. And the card. It felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket, even though it was just a piece of paper. The next day, I told myself it was all in my head. Just a weird encounter with a creepy guy, nothing more. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That man, whatever he was, wasn't normal. And that blank card, it meant something. Something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. A week later, I found out. The card hadn't left my mind since that night. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it, like it was some kind of puzzle I needed to solve. One night, after another long shift, I took it out of my wallet and stared at it again. Then, to my horror, I noticed something different. The card was no longer blank. It had one word, written in small, neat letters. Run. And that's when I heard the footsteps behind me.